I was 22 years old attending a Halloween party at my former best friend Nick's house, who died of a heroin overdose in 2013. Before his death, he would throw big Halloween parties every year at his house, as his parents routinely flew to New York every year to attend their own friend's party. He was always a big Halloween freak, so the whole house was littered with truly horrifying props that we all knew Nick spent way too much money on. He even put up giant walls of cardboard and covered them with wallpaper to create a haunted maze of sorts. I want to keep this story PG-13 rated, so I'll skip the weed, the bear, LSD, and sex, and get right to the part where things got bad. I'll admit we weren't in our right minds, none of us were. Anyone who came to Nick's parties knew what went down. Me, Nick, and a few other guys, Vinny G, Joey, and Q, were upstairs in Nick's room smoking a bong when we heard two steady loud bangs coming from downstairs. Nick clumsily but panic-stricken rushed to open the door to see what was going on. There were the sounds of screaming of both guys and girls. I remember quite clearly it sounded as if there were a crowd of people screaming for their lives down there. We all called Nick to come back in and shut the door. Even under the influence of drugs, we all knew what was going on. Nick ran back inside and shut the door quickly, but also quietly, locking it behind him. He turned to us, having the facial expression of someone who had just witnessed murder. "What did you see? What's going on?" we all said to him. He told us to hide before anything else. We all knew why. From that point on, we didn't ask questions. Nick hid the lights and hid in the closet with Joey, while I hid under the bed with Q, and Vinny G hid in the storage box. We could hear the blasting music from downstairs turn off, followed by a grown man screaming at everyone to shut up. One unfortunate girl let out a scream of shock and fear, and after another bang, silence. The man started shouting at everyone again, but personally, I couldn't hear it too well, and I certainly wouldn't remember exactly what he was shouting. We also heard two other men shouting. By now, there were a confirmed 3 intruders in the house, but there could have been more for all we knew at that point. We heard the sound of boots stomping up the stairs, and then coming halfway down the hall and stopping outside the bedroom door. The intruder on the other side of the door tried the doorknob, but when he realized it was locked, he started ramming into the door with most likely his shoulder. After a few failed attempts at that, the sound of a few shots to the doorknob were clearly enough to break the lock, allowing the door to swing open. We heard cries from downstairs after the shots to the doorknob, followed by a silencing gunshot. Me and Nick had our hands over our mouths to shield our breathing noises. I watched through the transparent cloth that hung from the bottom of Nick's bed as the black boots with overlapping torn denim chains moved instinctively to the closet. He opened the door. I could hear Nick begging the intruder not to kill him, offering a generous amount of money if they would leave. Nick gave himself up as the house owner. That's when the intruder ordered him downstairs. The rest of us stayed put. Apparently Joey hadn't been caught with Nick. We stayed under the bed, shaking and afraid. There was near silence from downstairs, other than Nick talking with the intruders. But whatever they were saying was much too low for us to hear. It felt like a near 20 minutes before the front door slammed shut, and Nick came running back upstairs to tell us that they were gone. I think the most horrifying moment of my life was when I stepped downstairs back into the living room and saw the 2 dead bodies lying lifelessly on the ground with holes in their heads, spewing out blood. Jen and Robbie, 2 good friends that I still miss. I'll spare you the details of what happened when the police arrived, but despite the fact that the house smelled like a marijuana greenhouse, the police were more interested in finding who the masked men were that killed 2 innocent college students. Oh yeah, Nick told the 4 of us hiding in his room that there were 4 intruders in total, all wearing fedoras, vendetta masks, coats, and gloves. They demanded $100,000 in cash, and when Nick could not provide it, they demanded he fill their empty sacks with his most valuable possessions. All of the partygoers held hostage in the room were also forced to throw their wallets into the sack, or they would be shot. After the incident, Nick became depressed. He started drinking too much, becoming an alcoholic. He stopped showing up to school, and ultimately ended up dropping out. He started to use the heavier drugs such as meth and heroin. I had one good talk with him since the incident, and he was more real during this talk than he had ever been. He told me with tears rolling down his cheeks and a pipe in his hand, he lived in constant pain, knowing he caused the death of two of his best friends. Nick died of a heroin overdose in July of 2013, not even a year after the incident. It was my first Halloween living in my own house away from my parents. I lived in a small corner house with a basement, but no upstairs. A house my parents paid half for. It was 11 o'clock at night. I was sitting in the living room watching scary Halloween movies when I found myself getting up to answer a knock at the door. But then I stopped and thought, who could be at the door at 11 p.m.? Surely there were no more trick-or-treaters out. I had a pretty good feeling it was a late-night Halloween ding-dong ditcher, so I gave it a second. Then I shot a glance at the front porch through the window. They were gone already. Yup, ding-dong ditchers. I sat back down, not thinking twice about it, and then again, knocking at the front door. "Get lost!" I yelled. I was not in the mood for punk kids. They ignored my demands and started pounding now, not just knocking. I was pissed now. I leapt up and swung the door open. No one was there once again. I slipped on my shoes and headed outside to begin searching the bushes for the kids. But there was nobody in sight. Not in the bushes, not behind my car, not across the street. I was done answering. I didn't want to feed into their fun anymore, so I went back inside, double-locked the door, and went to my bedroom, also locking that door just to feel safer, I guess. Even over the TV, I could still hear the stupid kids pounding on my front door repeatedly. I was so close to calling the cops to get them away, but that would undoubtedly lead to my house being egged or TP'd. The pounding continued for an uncomfortably long time, more than half an hour. I thought these kids must be filming something for YouTube, and were desperate for a reaction, but I wasn't going to give it to them. At some point, I dozed off with the TV on, only to wake up to the knocking again. I looked at the clock. It was 2 o'clock in the fucking morning. How could those kids still be at it, I thought. I turned the TV off and sat up with my ears open for a few moments. My heart completely stopped as I realized the knocking was no longer at my front door, but rather at my bedroom door. I jumped out of bed, looking around my room like a madman for something to use as a weapon. They knew I was awake now. They were trying the doorknob, trying to burst down the door. These weren't any kids. By some miracle, I came up with an idea. It was a long shot, but it was all I could think of. I turned on the receiver to my speaker system, plugged in my iPhone, brought up the YouTube app, typed in 45 gunshot sound effects, turned on the volume, and pressed play. The sound of a gunshot echoed loudly from the speakers. It sounded real enough. I paused the video after the first shot and yelled, "That was a warning shot! Leave now, or I won't hesitate to shoot you in the head." And it worked. I heard 2 pairs of footsteps stomping over my wood floors and out the front door. I gave it a moment before opening my bedroom door and peeking outside. They were gone, but the front door was left wide open. I quickly shut it, called the police, and that's where my story ended. This story took place on Halloween night. I took my 7-year-old daughter, Jamie, trick-or-treating for a few hours, and when we got back, I cooked dinner. We watched a movie together, and then I sent her to bed. I was feeling especially tired that night, so I brushed up and went to sleep. Shortly after, my daughter woke me up and told me there was someone in her closet. I assured her there was no one in her closet. She asked to sleep with me, but I once again assured her that she was safe in her room. She reluctantly went back to her room and shut the door. I made a mental note that if she came back again, I would walk her to her closet and show her that there's no one in there. Surely enough, 5 minutes later she came back. I asked her why she thought there was someone in her closet. She responded saying she heard someone moving around and things falling over. Honestly, when she said that, it kind of made my heart jump for a second. I walked her to her room and turned on the lights. I jokingly asked, "Is anybody in there?" We stood and listened. I didn't expect to hear anything. Bump! There it was, a thud from inside the closet. I screamed at Jamie to run to the neighbors and call the police. As she did, I swung the door open and was shocked to find the neighbor's son Randy sitting on top of my daughter's Lego box. I grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and yanked him up aggressively. I then walked him angrily back to his parents' house next door and found Jamie ringing the doorbell. When they answered, I shoved him inside right into his father and explained everything. I told him I wouldn't press charges, but if I ever caught him near my daughter again, they would all be sorry. Randy's dad slapped him across the face, then asked me to come inside to allow Randy to explain himself. Me and Jamie both went inside. Apparently, while I was taking Jamie trick-or-treating, he had snuck into our house through an open window and hid in her closet with his friend Daryl. I asked him if this Daryl kid was still in my house. He said yes. I told Jamie to wait with Mark while I ran back to our house, and right as I entered, there he was, this Daryl kid, uglier and shadier looking than Randy. He had my daughter's underwear in his hand. What I did next was completely out of fatherly protective anger. I grabbed the little shit by the throat and threw him to the floor, slapping him 4 times in the face, then hesitantly allowing him to get up and leave. The only reason I didn't call the police was because of my close friendship with Mark, but I made my point very strongly that if they ever so even waved to my daughter again, they would be in the news the next day. We went back to sleep, and I let Jamie sleep with me after that incident. She was horrified. The next morning, I found a small drilled hole in her closet door. The sick little bastard was spying on my daughter while she slept, at the same time playing with her underwear. Maybe you don't understand the horror of this story unless you're a parent, but there are many days that I think I made a mistake not calling the police. I still can, but nothing has happened since, and I figure I shouldn't create more trouble now. Jamie's 13 now, and that creep Randy has since gone away to college. My cousin, Ethan, and I grew up together. I never liked him very much. His family was rich, so he always had the best stuff. Mine wasn't. I didn't have the best stuff. On Halloween 1985, we were going trick-or-treating together. I was the Terminator. He was Freddy Krueger. His mask cost almost $100, and it looked exactly like Freddy's face. The scars, the snare, everything was just right. In retrospect, it's ironic he chose Freddy as his costume, which will make sense later. I didn't have a mask. My parents couldn't afford one. I had torn aluminum foil taped to the side of my face. It was meant to look like the Terminator after some of its skin had been ripped off. A few splotches of ketchup on the foil were supposed to look like blood. As soon as it dried, it looked very little like dried blood and very much like dried ketchup. Despite my terrible costume, I was still excited to trick-or-treat. We didn't have candy very often at home, except maybe on Easter. My parents encouraged me to go to as many houses as I wanted to get all the candy I'd be able to eat. I felt good to know that they wanted me to be happy. Ethan and I went out at sundown and visited house after house. Every time the homeowners would gush over Ethan's mask, they'd tell him how scary it was, how realistic. Then they'd turn to me and ask who I was supposed to be. I'd answer. Then they'd say something like, "Oh, of course, how could I have missed it?" I could tell they felt sorry for me. One even handed me an extra few pieces of candy. When we were done, our pillowcases stuffed filled with treats of every sort, we began the long walk home. As we went, Ethan rooted around in his bag of loot. I could hear him grumbling and complaining through his mask. Then he started throwing candy on the street, stuff he didn't like. "Go ahead and pick it up if you want it, Bill," he called out, heaving handful after handful into the gutter. "I know you can't afford to let anything go to waste." I didn't say anything, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out the lighter and one of the 2 cigarettes I'd stolen from my dad. I'd been smoking on and off for the last few months, and even at 13, I knew it was bad for me. I just didn't care. It made me feel good. I stayed a few steps behind Ethan as he tossed more candy away, and as much as I hated myself for it, I ended up picking up a few pieces off the ground and putting them into my bag. Ethan caught me once and laughed. "You're gonna be as fat as your mom if you eat all that." I kept my mouth shut. Is that why she got fired from the restaurant? Did she eat a customer's food? I knew Ethan was joking. He did it often. I'm sure in his mind he thought he was being harmless and playful. Still, I told him more than a few times to leave my mom out of the jokes. She had diabetes, and she hadn't mentioned it to anyone other than my dad and me. But the doctor told her she might end up losing her foot. That's why the restaurant let her go. She couldn't walk around and wait tables anymore. "Change the subject, Ethan," I said. I knew he heard me, and he didn't talk for another minute or so, until he did again. "You think her and your dad still fuck? I wonder how he manages to get it in there." He cackled, then insisted, Okay, I'm sorry, I'm done. Promise." I seethed as we took a shortcut through the elementary school soccer field. "Let's stop here for a minute," Ethan said. We'd gotten to the school's playground. "I bet I could scare the shit out of some kids if they come by." He sat on one of the swings with his pillowcase on his lap. He kicked his legs and the swing moved back and forth. I stood there hating him. "I think I see some kids coming over the hill," I told Ethan. "I'm going to hide behind the slide and sneak up if they come over to you." "Go for it," Ethan told me, his voice deep and distorted through the mask. I left Ethan on the swing set and walked over to the slide. I watched him swing as his hateful words rang in my ears. Tears came to my eyes, and I remembered Mom smiling from her spot on the couch as she encouraged me to go out and have fun. She was such a good person. So good. She'd never said anything negative about Ethan. In fact, she always complimented him on his grades and his wins in basketball, and even his looks. "You're going to be a handsome man, Ethan," she told him. "I bet we'll see your face in magazines someday." Even after her kindness, Ethan still felt it was okay to trash her. I heard him laughing to himself across the playground. I didn't know why exactly, but I had a pretty good idea. I reached into my jacket for the other cigarette, knowing the smoke would calm me down, but it had come apart. My pocket was full of loose tobacco and paper. Loose tobacco, paper, and the lighter. Ethan was still laughing as I fingered the lighter in my pocket for a second, then pulled it out. I walked up behind him. He didn't know I was there as he shouted out, "Okay, one more thing, and I'll never say anything about her again. But unless your dad's got a big dick, he'll never manage to..." I flicked the lighter near the back of Ethan's neck, right where his hair and mask met. The hair went up quickly, using his hairspray as an accelerant. Then something happened that I didn't expect. The mask burst into flames. Ethan jumped off the swing and ran in a loose circle, trying to pull the mask off his head. I saw it ripping under his fingers. He couldn't get a grip. The material bubbled. His screams barely muffled as the molten chemicals clung to his skin, echoed off the brick wall of the elementary school. After a few seconds, he fell and rolled around on the playground, pushing his head into the sand to put the fire out. And he succeeded, but the damage was done. He turned over on his back, no longer screaming, but gasping in shallow, hyperventilated breaths. In the moonlight, I saw the mask was completely fused to what remained of his skin. One of his eyes had apparently burst, but his other darted around almost like he was confused and wondering where he was. I saw something moving on the other side of the field. Kids were coming. I yelled to them to call an ambulance. As this was a time before cell phones, some of them ran home to get help, and I waited, unsure of how I felt, until the paramedics got there. I took complete responsibility for setting Ethan on fire. I said I'd been sneaking up to scare him by flicking the lighter near his face, and yes, I got in a lot of trouble. But everyone believed it was an accident. Ethan's face was destroyed. He had skin grafts and bone grafts and all sorts of reconstructive surgery. He never recovered, not physically, not emotionally. He killed himself in 1990. His parents had a very expensive funeral. I was invited. They'd forgiven me for my part in his accident years before. In fact, their subsequent lawsuit against the mask company is the reason why Halloween masks are now made with flame-retardant materials. Mom died a few years before Ethan, but not before complications from her diabetes took her left leg. Dad and I were with her in the hospital at the same time Ethan's parents were there to see him through another round of reconstructive surgery. They visited Mom, Dad, and I while Ethan was still under, recovering after a successful set of grafts. We chatted for a little while about Mom's hopes for recovery, and then the topic moved to Ethan. Ethan's mom was gushing about a plastic surgeon that had recently joined the hospital after working in Switzerland. He was the best, apparently. He'd taken on Ethan's case earlier in the year, albeit remotely, and wrote a substantial article about the new techniques he'd be employing. In the world of plastic surgery, it made a big splash, if only for its ambition. Ethan's mom reached into her purse and pulled out the publication. She flipped it open to the page that showed various photographs of Ethan's burns, and the notes and explanations the surgeon had written to accompany the article. I could tell Mom was holding back tears. I knew why too. Her eyes met mine, and she couldn't hold back any longer. She began to weep. Dad and Ethan's mother held her while she cried. I just watched. Mom was thinking that she'd been right all those years ago. She'd been right for all the wrong reasons, but right nonetheless. Just like she'd predicted, Ethan's face had finally made it into a magazine.